All right, here we go. Kinesiology 223, Chapter 7, still on feedback, reinforcement, intrinsic motivation. The book in this part or this section of the book in this chapter, they go into intrinsic and extrinsic rewards and also self-determination theory. So with that, let's get going on book presentation number 6. It's a little bit awkward, right? Because we've already talked a little bit about intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, so it feels like this is a circuitous kind of conversation. We keep going back to the same thing. But I'm going to take this opportunity to, um, talk a little bit through this, and they do a good job as a setup regarding like the different factors that affect both intrinsic and extrinsic. So they revisit this concept for with purpose. But they point out that most leagues they offer banquets, etc., which you receive awards and trophies. And in youth sports, it's become very much a part of youth sports where you just get a participation trophy. And there's a part of me that kind of cringes at that because you're just showing up. You're not really as a team succeeding. You still get a trophy, or if you become champions, you get a trophy. It's the same trophy. So what's the difference? But I get the understanding behind this, and I get the teaching behind this, right? You come together, you work as a team, you practice each day, you go and play your sport. And so as a result, the reward, the extrinsic reward that's being given is for participation, which is participation oriented, and it becomes process oriented as opposed to outcome oriented. And what you find is in terms of extrinsic motivators, in some regard, athletes can have the ability to look at playing a sport and being involved, etc. And that they find a way to make extrinsic rewards become a little bit more intrinsic. But at a youth level, most of your athletes are probably not playing for the trophy at the end of the year. It's like you hand them a trophy at a banquet, they're like, thank you so much. What they what they're really playing for is the fun of it, to be with their friends, etc. And many times you'll have parents who are kind of jamming their kids into a sport. And, as a coach, you have to find a way to kind of leverage that process to be able to help your athletes become more intrinsically motivated and minimize the extrinsic rewards that you provide to your athletes. So, the reward structure can be both positive and negative. We've talked about that. And I think this is kind of a key part when you talk about intrinsic motivation. You strive to become competent and self-determining, to master a skill or a task at hand. And it's the enjoyment in competition, it's the fun and the excitement and the focus in the moment and the ability to really just have a love for a sport and want to be better as an athlete. And when you start to operate from that area as an athlete, oh man, that's a great place to be because it doesn't feel like drudgery. It doesn't feel like work. It feels like you're really kind of crafting your skill and making yourself a better athlete. I will say this, when you start getting into higher levels of athleticism and there's pay to play, of course, there's more extrinsic involved because people are paid. But when you're talking high school or maybe even college, NIL aside, there's kind of a love of the sport where people play because they enjoy playing. Now, in higher levels like Division One, FCS and FBS, those schools offer scholarships, and even Division Two, they offer scholarships. So as a result, there's a little bit of a pay to play and an extrinsic motivator that's there for those athletes to retain their scholarship. But different athletes will, they'll present with varying degrees of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And also it comes down to a conversation in terms of those athletes will present with varying degrees of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation based off of varying degrees of how they were coached or just how they're wired. And in some regards, the conversation comes down to nature versus nurture. And the point you have here in the book is you have athletes and you have these kind of social constructs that are in place that help formulate what affects intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And I would contest that these very same factors that affect intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, they're also factors that affect the athlete. And the athlete that comes to you today has an entire body of work that leads up to the very moment you meet that athlete. So you have to understand that somewhere along the line, they were born, they're wired a certain way, then within that wiring, they've probably met any number of different coaches in any number of different sports. And so you have a nurture side. Their parents have probably guided them and redirected them regarding competitiveness, etc., and ways to feel good about oneself. Or they've rewarded them with an ice cream at the end of a good practice to be an extrinsic type of reward. So, these are the types of things that make up the person that's standing in front of you. Success and failure both help define one's sense of competency, because success and failure are, in fact, both feedback mechanisms. And many times it's the failures where you learn the most, And then with within the context, again, of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, you're looking at focusing on competition, and you have this kind of standard of excellence that you're competing against. And sometimes that standard of excellence can be an extrinsic motivation. Say there's a school record for the breaststroke, and you want to beat that record. You have to make the argument and have a conversation of, well, that's an extrinsic motivator because it's a record somebody else set, but I want to beat it. I'm adopting that into my own self, and it kind of becomes intrinsic. Okay? So now you have a little bit of this murky line between the two, but my point is you try to find ways to make extrinsic motivators more intrinsic in nature. Beyond that, you also have the coaching behaviors, both positive and negative, like I talked about earlier. You have this nature-nurture mindset where an athlete will come to you and perhaps they had just like this drill sergeant, dictator, authoritarian coach. And as a result, they'll have a certain expectation in terms of how they should be coached. And now you come in as a more benevolent coach and you have a different persona, and it creates a rift. So, you have to be able to understand who's in front of you. The book then transitions into self-determination theory, and it argues that you have this competence, autonomy, and relatedness that are the hallmarks of self-determination theory. And you'd like to have, not only as a person, but as an athlete, the ability to, have these three things within your competitive environment and practice environment. You want to have the ability to, if you're fortunate enough, you have the competency to be able to play in a particular sport, and, you're confident in your abilities to be able to succeed. And then from that, you need to have some autonomy to be able to make your own decisions and own your own decisions. Otherwise, they're nothing more than extrinsic motivators, somebody handing you edicts and directives for you to do things. And then lastly, the need for relatedness, to care for others and be part of that tribe, like I always mention and talk about. That's kind of part of being a part of a sports team. You're all going towards the same goal, but you're all trying to master different skill sets as you work together to go ahead and win conference or state. The book makes a point in terms of, do extrinsic rewards undermine intrinsic motivation? And in some regards, yes, right? We know that intrinsic related behavior is related to several positive outcomes. We've already talked about several of them. And when a person sees themselves, as a cause of their own behavior, they have this intrinsic driver, they can take greater ownership of their behavior, and then by default take greater ownership of the outcomes of those behaviors. And then when the cause of the person's behavior is outside of the person, that's extrinsic, then it becomes a conversation of, how can that person possibly take ownership of the end results if they can't take ownership of the behavior because they're extrinsically motivated? They're motivated by somebody else. You want your athletes to take ownership of the process. You want them to understand the outcome, and you want them to really wrap themselves around it and give it a big hug as they move forward and trying to achieve their goals. And I'll tell you, you give me a team of athletes who have a real high intrinsic motivation, they're going to be a dominant team, because every single person on that team are trying to do something a little bit better each day. And you don't have to, as a coach, bark at them all the time to do something better. And as a coach, if you can cultivate that environment, think about in terms of your own bandwidth as a coach. You only have X amount of time to work with your athletes, and if you're spending all of your time giving directions and having your athletes do things, and you're offering extrinsic rewards to motivate them, it takes away from your ability to be effective as a coach when you have, conversely, a whole team of intrinsically motivated people who want to do better and are really focused on the task at hand. you can then focus on the task at hand and work on skill refinement better to make them better athletes in whatever sport they play. So, it's also a time management thing. We start talking about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation as a coach. Yep. I'm sorry I didn't open this up when I was talking about the intrinsic motivation, how they take ownership of it, but it really comes down to that, right? I mean, just logically, if you think it through and game it out, if I am my own person and I have agency and I have um, and I am the cause of my own behavior, then I am the one who is the cause of those results. I can't play victim. I can take ownership, good or bad. And that's also another important part of this as an athlete. That's that feedback component where if you have high intrinsic motivation and you take ownership of your behaviors and take ownership of the ownership of the outcome might be a poor result. And as an athlete, you have to be able to evaluate that and have good self-talk to evaluate where you may have been able to do better. It's all about ownership. And same thing, well, just as the extrinsic motivated, there'll be, the more individual is extrinsically motivated, the less a person will be intrinsically motivated, interestingly enough. I'm not going to belabor this, but I would urge you to take a look on page 142 and kind of compare and contrast some of the things that are going on in here and take a look at like integrated regulation, identified regulation, introjected, and look at like this harmonious passion versus obsessive passion. I will tell you, the book tries to differentiate over here between harmonious and obsessive. And I will tell you, if you're a college level athlete, you're kind of, they're stating a college athlete who have harmonious passion towards their sport. They'll be able to study and see friends. And I will tell you, probably most of the friends that you'll have will be the same people that are in your sport, or at least in the affinity group that is or are the athletic population. You're not hanging out with people who play tuba. You're not hanging out with somebody from the chess team or debate team unless they do that as well as play football or basketball. I would tell you that most higher end athletics, especially in college, are on the obsessive side, where you're kind of really hyper focused on your particular sport and your craft, and you do so at the expense. You might have relationships and friendships in your class, etc., but you're talking about working on your craft several hours a day, every day, maybe 5 days a week, in addition to your studies or study table or having dinner with your teammates. You might have a roommate who doesn't play a sport, and then you might have some crossover there. But usually, if I were to say between these two, if you're a college level athlete, you're probably not going to even have this in the statement. You're probably going to be more on the obsessive side. All right, I'm going to break from here and go into the next video, and I'll see